Hello.
How's it going?
It is good. Have my sustenance.
I have my coffee, Slancha. Happy, happy,
Cheers.
happy Monday, if that is a real phrase. Um, we're gonna make this one happy. And happy May, friends. We made it all the way to May. Um, April was one of the longest months in recent memory, especially for Emily Garrison. But we have made it, and I'm so happy to be here with all of you today for another Ladies Who Lunch session about the digital restoration series. So before we dive in, we should introduce everyone at the table. So directly below me on the screen, we have Emily Garrison. Emily is she's a DRS rock star, and she just wrapped Venice Preserved with me, a restoration tragedy by Thomas Otway. We finished recording a couple weeks ago, and last Saturday we had our Zoom performance. And she is here as actor, dramaturg, and also she has this sort of she has some special news to share that we will be coming back to in a moment. And then kitty corner to me on the screen, we have Jill Robinson.
Hello, everyone.
Jill is my queen. Jill is my stage manager, production stage manager in the digital restoration series. She is stage managing all of the projects that are in our lineup. And she is my right-hand woman and the just most amazing. She should be the leader of the free world, in my opinion. But Jill is here as my sort of like consummate co-pilot to talk about all the projects that we have done in 2021, beginning with the stratagem projects and then into Venice Preserved and the 2 table reads we had along the way. And our last guest is the luminous Claire Whitman. Claire is another actor in the digital restoration series who marvelously has been able to join us for a lot of more recent projects, including the stratagem projects. She's an amazing actor who works at Colonial Williamsburg and spends her days, nights, and all of the time in between thinking and writing about women from the 18th century. And as we move into this last phase of the digital restoration series, we are now sort of firmly settled in what scholars call the long 18th century. So called because everything in the world apparently happened in the 1700s, and so they needed a phrase that sort of captured that. But Claire, as someone who sort of lives and breathes 18th century life, as an actor at Colonial Williamsburg, is here as our sort of resident expert of the era. And also she's here to help us get hyped and excited for the very last audio drama in the digital restoration series, in which she will be starring, which is Richard Brinsley Sheridan's The School for Scandal. So I'm thrilled to have them all here today. Emily, I think what I would like to do, if you're okay with this, is save your special announcement for the end of the broadcast. So anyone who sticks around with us, you will be able to hear her special news and watch as Jill and Claire and I celebrate the heck out of her. So thank you all so much for joining me today. I feel like there's so many places where we could begin. It's been a long time since we've done a deep dive. Our last one was in late January. Amazingly, we hadn't even done the reading of The Way of the World yet. It was like the day before our reading. Isn't that amazing, Em?
Right.
Yeah, it was so long ago. So
truly feels like a different lifetime in the winter.
So I think I would like to start with Venice Preserved because it is the most recent project that we have done, and also it is a part of the Shipwreck Festival, which Sweet Tea Shakespeare is laying out across the months of April, May, and June. The Shipwreck Festival is a celebration of classical theater, early modern and restoration plays that either feature shipwrecks as a major plot point of the story or plays that were precipitated by shipwrecks. And it's astonishing how many of them there really are. Playwrights in the 16th, 17th, and 18th centuries seemed very interested in shipwrecks. And so some of them are self-explanatory, like The Tempest. I, of course, as our resident restoration freak, asked if we could insert Venice Preserved to that lineup, a play which does not feature a shipwreck, but was precipitated by a shipwreck. And Venice Preserved, which we performed last Saturday, is the only restoration tragedy in the DRS. It was our first and only sojourn into true classical iambic pentameter tragedy. Emily Garrison played Rosalba and Durand. So she played a maid, and she also played one of the conspirators set to topple the government. Jill was my stage manager, and I directed it. So I think we should start there. Emily, can you tell us a little bit about Venice Preserved, like what the story is, and then also your experiences as an actor inside of that project?
Yeah, definitely. What I think is most interesting to me about Venice Preserved is that I think that you can say that the story is about a lot of things. I think that on one level, the story is highly political, and it's about a group of conspirators who try to overthrow the senators and kill all of the senators and are foiled in this plan and then have to face the consequences of this. But I think on another level, it's also about trying to um, determine who you are most loyal to in your life, whether you're most loyal to your family and your spouse and the people who you are legally bound to, or the people who you choose to be bound to, like your friends. I think, kind of the main conflict in the play is Jafir's conflict between choosing his wife and protecting her and sort of protecting society as a whole by nature of that, like protecting the family unit, protecting legal status, and then choosing his friend who he also loves really dearly and following sort of his, what I would interpret as like his gut, like his following his passion um and in his inability to choose those things, both of those people and himself all meet tragic fates. So it's a love story, but it is also a story about indecision, and it's very much a political story. Um, and in terms of my own experience working in the play, this was the first DRS project that I had more observation time than stage time. And that was a blessing in so many ways. One, because the spring was a very crazy month for me, but also because this was a play that I think benefited so much from being heard. The scenes were all, and Claire, maybe you can say if this was intentional or if this is just intentional in your interpretation of the play or just how it was originally written. The scenes are so long. I feel like in some of the other DRS projects that we've worked on, the scenes sort of like move from plot point to plot point much quicker, and you have like a 4-page scene between these characters. But these scenes like stretched on, and the tension really builds between them. And what I really like to do during rehearsal is I would like close my eyes while I wasn't on stage so that I could hear it as an audio drama, and you can just hear it getting darker and darker and more tense as the play goes on. So it was a wonderful play to be able to have that space to observe and listen a little bit more.
Oh, that's awesome. Thank you. Well, to answer your question, it was not an artistic choice on my part. That is how the play is written, and in fact, in its original form, it is 3,500 words longer, and some of the longest scenes are even longer. Like, I wasn't cutting scenes or moments between characters.
Mm-hmm.
I was trying to trim the fat on very long, drawn out conversations. And also, and Thomas Otway, the playwright of Venice Preserved, he was a soldier before he was a playwright and traveled all over the world fighting for the crown, the English crown, which got a little gnarly when there was the succession crisis in the early 1680s. Charles II, who was our great, wonderful, hedonistic ruler, who came back as a 27-year-old, and ousted the protectorate and was restored to the throne and became King Charles II, the man who opened up all of the theaters because he was a pleasure seeker. He died without any legitimate heirs. Like he had, just a truckload of illegitimate kids from a host of mistresses, but he had no children with his wife who could inherit. And so when he died, there was this succession crisis, and some people threw, some lords in England threw their support behind his younger brother James, but James was a Catholic, and some threw support behind William and Mary, who were Protestants but further removed from the throne. And that was when it became very dangerous to have been a soldier for Charles II, because in the end, Charles left the throne to James. He left the throne to a Catholic. And so Otway's life went from being something that was, full of adventure, but kind of like understood, like he had a job that he knew how to do, and he would travel here and there and all over the world, fighting for the crown. He went from sort of having that job to having the job of kind of being on the run. And so he had this sort of chaotic midlife crisis. He eventually came to England and was like, well, I'm not going to be a soldier for a Catholic king. So he left the army, became a playwright, and the only thing he wanted to write about was politics. And Venice Preserved is like his masterpiece. And the way the play is structured, there are these very long, intimate, passionate debates between two people. It's just the whole play is this string of dynamic two-hander scenes in which almost inevitably one of the things they're talking about is, well, as Emily said, what are you loyal to? What do you believe in? What will you fight for? Right? Or I'm going to try to get you to fight for what I believe in. Right? It's either asking or it's convincing, but it's all about political ideology. And I think part of the reason that was so fascinating to him and that he wrote such long, in-depth scenes about it is because those were exactly the conversations that kind of defined the middle of his life. Like, he would have heard those conversations between soldiers, he would have heard them between nobility, he would have heard them between the people coming to see the plays at the Playhouse. And so there is a kind of like forcefulness to the play, even though these scenes are so long, because it often comes down to two people duking it out intellectually and then sometimes physically about what do I believe versus what do you believe. It was really fun to make that foray into tragedy after spending so much time in the realm of comedy, which, as we've discussed on these deep dive podcasts before, are not always comedic and not always happy. But they do have a very different formula and a very different ethos and set of priorities than Venice Preserved. And Venice it's dark, and it just gets darker and darker as you go along. So Jill, I'm going to sort of pivot to you because you've been with me from the very beginning. So this is your first time stage managing a tragedy. How do you receive Venice Preserved?
Yeah, I think just to start it off personally, I love political drama. Like that's one of my top faves, sort of like worlds to live in when it comes to theater. It kind of just goes back to what's really close to my heart is like very much theater for purpose, or like using theater as a means to express whether it be subtly or outrightly like a political message in some shape or form. And I think Venice Preserved, like Emily was saying, like there was so many different pathways that piece could allow the performer and the audience member to kind of have an opinion or be influenced by, right? Whether it be like the micro relationships or like the macro social unrest that's happening in the piece. So that was really cool to kind of live there for this installment of the DRS. And again, kind of what Emily was saying too, this piece does have a lot of like observer roles that kind of either come in and leave, or they like come in multiple times. But I remember throughout the whole process, Claire, like we do with every character in the DRS, we give every character their backstory, right? And like kind of have a moment where we meditate on like what their lives were prior to the piece, or why are they making these decisions in this piece, and a really cool exercise, or a really cool investigation with this piece in particular, is when we went through each conspirator and we talked about them as individuals, and like what brought them to be a part of this sort of rebel team, and how are they, where do they fit in Renaud or Pierre's, whoever's in power at a certain moment, puzzle to kind of overthrow the government. And it was cool because we kind of joke sometimes in rehearsal of like, oh, there should be a prequel for this character, or I could totally see a play being written about just this relationship. And I found with all of the observer characters in this piece in particular, I was like, I want to know all about Elliot's story, right? Like this one conspirator, like why is he an exiled Englishman? Like I want to know like every single beat of his journey up till now. So that was really, and I think like it's just by the nature, right, of the piece, of there are so many of these characters that they're all working towards this giant, extremely risky overtaking, but like because they kind of they can't really slip up, they can't afford to, we had to like really go into each individual one and their like psyches and how they tick or why they're doing that. And I love when that happens, because then again, like the entire heartbeat of the piece is like soldiers marching forward kind of thing, right?
Yeah, I loved that rehearsal where we talked about each of the conspirators, and the backstories and like why they were there, and also what they felt about this very dramatic scene that happens the second time the conspirators all meet. My character wasn't in the first scene that the conspirators all meet in, so I mostly think of the second one. But in the second scene, it's scene 9, right, or scene 7?
Scene 6.
Oh, scene 6, yeah. Where like the couple almost breaks up, and then there's a murder attempt and a murder threat, and then one of the conspirators is trying to take power, and then the other one takes power, and then one runs away, and then we all try to kill that one. Like it's this very intense scene, and I really remember feeling a difference between realizing like, oh, not only is is like really thinking through like what brings like each of these conspirators to the point where they really are willing to risk everything to kill all of the senators in Venice. And I think that it's fun also because that is like what makes acting such a joy, is really getting into think like, all right, like if I know only these 3 lines about Durand, like I know that she has a bunch of soldiers that she's going to set loose in the Rialto, and I know like that she's really eager to be there, and I know that she's often paired with this like other person. Like what can I get from that? And getting to sort of play that mind game, I think, was a really fun opportunity. And it's a very exciting scene and a very intense one. I'm excited to hear that one.
Absolutely. It really is the Restoration Julius Caesar. There's also elements of Merchant of Venice, right? An investigation of socioeconomic stratification, the way that Merchant is, right? Merchant is the have and have-nots, and because it's also set in Venice, we have that whole sphere. We also have the sphere of Othello, this idea that a young woman has married secretly against her father's wishes, and she's married someone who is distasteful to her father, right, and to her very privileged white elite upbringing. So we have elements of Othello, we have elements of Merchant of Venice, but ultimately it's Julius Caesar during the Restoration in Venice, and we get
Julius Caesar that doesn't go too well.
Julius Caesar also doesn't go well. It's
this is true.
Julius Caesar is what happens if they succeed and then all die, and this one is like, what if they don't succeed and also all die?
True.
Spoiler, but it's a tragedy. I don't know what you're expecting.
Well, and Claire, just to add to the whole vibe and the shift, right? Like you were saying, this is the only tragedy in DRS, and like you and I, who have been on a part of all of the pieces. Like in rehearsal for this one, especially, there's the vibe of like, it's a roller coaster, right? Like when once it goes down, it just starts going down. And that paired with, because it's a tragedy, there's very little, if any, moments of like light or laughter or like a take a breath. Being on the side of the screen, I guess you could say, where watching it, like this piece in particular, my heart was like constantly pounding and the adrenaline was so high. This is just being like an observer, like not even being in the scenes. And like, it's so true. There's not many moments to like take a breath. And so just kind of speaking to like the difference between operating or combing through a tragedy versus or restoration tragedy versus restoration comedy, of like, you don't really get a release. It's kind of like the show starts and you are there, like
you're strapped in.
Oh my goodness.
Well,
yeah.
And that's partly how I directed it too, because I'm not a fan of tragedies at all, of any era or age. But something that I am interested in is like the genre of like political thriller, and I'm interested in noir. And so I sort of took a cue from the production that the RSC did in 2018, where they really stripped down the story to its basic plot, and shortened a lot of those long, lugubrious, melodramatic scenes, and just did the whole thing at a breakneck pace and directed it like a political thriller. And that, to me, is exactly the way to tackle it, because there is no levity in the play. This is not a Shakespearean tragedy where there are moments of great humor, black humor peppered in. We're not in that realm at all. It's just straight darkness and sadness for 2 hours, because that is the way that the play is formed. It seemed futile to me to try to create those releases if they're not in the text. And instead I was like, you know what, we're just gonna barrel through, and we're just gonna play this like these characters are running against the clock, right? Running out of time, taking desperate measure after desperate measure, and not allowing themselves time to breathe or release or break or reflect or think, right? We're just gonna run until they hit the wall at the very end. Because that feels truthful to me. That feels like what we would do if we were in those high stakes situations. We wouldn't sit around being like, now let's have a laugh, you know? we would just keep trying things. We would just try, we would keep trying tactics until we were totally out and our back was up against the wall. So Claire Whitman, you came and saw Venice Preserved, but you were not part of the rehearsal process. And I think this was your introduction to the play, was it not?
Hearing about this play through the DRS was the first time I'd encountered it at all, and while I sort of gave myself a preview by reading through the script before seeing the show, it came to life in performance in a beautiful way. And I'd like to go back for a moment to what Emily was talking about of coming up with the backstories for each of these conspirators. And it strikes me as being something that is critically important to a Zoom production, that every character know precisely what their point of view is on these incredibly high-stakes situations at all times, because there's nowhere to hide. It's not quite film. You can't pan away. It's not quite on stage where you can sort of conceal yourself. Yeah. So having that deep and intimate knowledge of your character's point of view on each of these sort of grand and terrifying or horrific occurrences seems so critical to this particular medium. And I think it's something that has probably shown up throughout the DRS in these various crowd scenes. I'm thinking about the ball, the masquerade, in Belle's Stratagem. Once again, perhaps characters who may not speak a great deal, but have to have a clear perspective on the events of the scene.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for that. I think that's so true. And it's always one of my favorite parts of any process, actually, is looking and reaching backwards. Either diving into what the text offers us about what came before, or just purely inventing, right, from what seems to make sense for our production. And And, you know, from there, I think we can pivot so many ways. But because you have brought up Belle's stratagem, Claire, brilliantly, I think it would behoove us to talk about the stratagems, because we were only just getting started when we interviewed when we did our January conversation. Like, we were at the very, very beginning of that 10-week process. And so it would be great to sort of go back and reflect on it in retrospect. So the Stratagem Project consisted of 2 audio dramas, which we rehearsed in repertory with one company of 16 actors, which included myself and Claire Whitman. We began in the early days of January 2021, and we concluded the project on March 12th, 10 entire weeks later. The project was comprised of 2 plays about stratagems. George Farquhar's 1707 late Restoration comedy, The Beaux Stratagem, about a pair of young rakes from London who decide to refill their coffers and try to make some quick cash by seducing an heiress in the country. And hijinks ensue. And The Belle's Stratagem is Hannah Cooley's late 18th century proto-feminist response to that play and to kind of the genre of Restoration theater in general, The Belle's Stratagem. And in The Belle's Stratagem, a young woman who has been engaged since birth to a man she barely knows, when she realizes that he does not feel any affection for her, decides that she is going to run a string of her own cons to try to trick and beguile him into falling in love with her. And that is sort of set against the backdrop of London society as Cooley knew it in 1780. And so we have these 2 plays from the 18th century, 70 years apart, in different realms entirely of human history and English history. And we did it with the same company to sort of explore what the long 18th century did for theater, and also what it did to the perception of women, and what it did to our notion of the comedy of manners itself. So Claire, let us please begin with you. If you can just tell us, like, what your experience was of that sort of long galactic process, who you played, and what it meant to you.
Well, by all means, first I wanted to point out something that I've only just noticed about these 2 plays working in tandem, if that's all right, is that we talk about in Beaux Stratagem, the rakes are from London, and they go to the country. And it strikes me that then in Belle's Stratagem, we have various people coming to London, some from the country, Lady Frances from the country, Letitia from boarding school, Dora Court from the continent. Mm-hmm. It's an interesting reversal that I'd only just now noticed. And I think perhaps that's the most wonderful thing about my experience with these plays, is that I felt like every time I read through, every time that we entered a new rehearsal, I learned something new about the way the play itself was constructed, and about the characters within it and in our particular productions. So in The Belle's Stratagem, I played Lady Frances, who is sort of the foil to Letitia Hardy, played inimitably by Claire Martin. And I think they perhaps represent sort of a spectrum of the experiences of women. And indeed, The Belle's Stratagem in particular represents a spectrum of the experiences of women in the 18th century, from these women like Letitia, who is perhaps somewhat under the influence of, the burgeoning Mary Wollstonecraft crowd, who are very much looking forward into sort of the 19th century and a degree of freedom that perhaps they had not experienced before, while other women like Lady Frances, it was almost as if they were regressing from the freedoms afforded by the Restoration into what would almost become the sort of the Victorian mode of, as they call Lady Frances, of the jewel in the case. And that one woman's losing of her freedom is set against the other gaining hers. And I don't know, and it is something I fear I've said it before, but I do think it's deeply important, and something that's important to my personal research is that there's no one box into which you can put the 18th century woman. Yeah. And I think that Belle's Stratagem in particular, but I would say greatly in Beaux as well, shows us this, that, you know, we have Mrs. Sullen and Dorinda could not be more different, and yet we also see their deep friendship with one another. And one of my favorite things about these plays is that they show a community of women.
Yeah.
Women who support one another, who are entirely different and yet are bonded by common circumstances or bonded by their dissimilarities.
Right.
Might say in the case of perhaps Dorinda and Mrs. Sully. They complete one another.
Mm-hmm.
Beautiful friendship. And I think it's lovely to see that, because it's not unsurprising to see sort of our Archer and Aimwell duos, but we have just as strong a duo on the other side. And that's been one of my favorite things, it truly, is to get to work with such extraordinary actresses and to get to learn from the rest of the company.
Oh, marvelous. And we have learned from you. Are you kidding me? Your Lady Frances was every bit as inimitable. And it was such a delight. It was such a delight to be paired with you in that way. We never had scenes together until the very end, which felt very intentional on Cooley's part, to make sure that we could focus on one's story and then the other. But you know, to play Letitia, a woman, you know, also kind of as like the Venice Preserved group, kind of racing against the clock. She has about 5 days to either convince Doracourt, the man that she is desperately in love with, to be desperately in love with her, or to break off the engagement, because she is so profoundly afraid of marrying a man who does not love her, because she is so afraid of what that will mean for her freedom and her future. And she is reckless and impetuous and loud and messy and wrong so much of the time. And she's she's a whirligig. But she's definitely not, she's not without her faults and foibles. And she definitely learns about herself, and learns to rise a little bit up out of the narcissism that drives sort of many of her actions. And it was so marvelous, Claire, I think, to be exploring Letty, and her wild whirling world, alongside working with you as Lady Frances Touchwood, who, you know, on paper and in many ways is, you know, characteristically polar opposite of Letitia. And yet, as we worked together, we discovered so many similarities about their desires and fears, their hopes and their dreams, and also their sense of restraint in the society they were in, right? They just had different ways of dealing with those restraints, but they both recognized that they were there. Your Lady Frances was just like, she was aglow, as you are, with such grace and kindness and sadness, and was, you know, kind of a wistfulness, for what would never be. And that was such a beautiful yin to the yang of Letitia striving to get the thing that would work so that she would not be stuck in a marriage where the rest of her life would be wistfulness. Yeah.
Indeed. And I think you talk about Letitia has this time clock.
Mm-hmm.
Days to make him love me. And on the other side, I feel Frances is a woman for whom the clock seems to have run out already.
Yeah.
And faced on the other side of that is, in some ways, a similar objective. I have the rest of my life to try to make him love me, but oh God, at what cost? And searching sort of in comparison for a love that has been lost.
Yeah.
And with someone who is doing everything to combat loving her truly by loving her as a possession. But I do think it's one of the wonderful things, I think Bryson spoke so beautifully of Sir George and that journey as well, which is just as important, is to see who is the human being behind this sort of blustering individual.
Yeah.
And I think it's the beauty of everything that I have been in and seen of the DRS is that everyone is searching deeper than just what is on the surface of these characters, or falling into the tropes that are present in this type of drama on the page, but that we get to make decisions about in our performances. And I think it's one of the great beauties of this project has been humanizing these 18th century people and finding the similarities that they have to us in our situations today, and why these plays continue to be deeply relevant and engaging for a 21st century audience.
Yeah. Thank you so much. And that's something, as we talked about when we had Ron on the show, you and I, Claire, we talked about how I really went in and tended to the story of Lady Frances, because I did not find the text that Cooley had written sufficient or even satisfactory for explaining her journey. Actually, I would go so far as to say she did not give Lady Frances much of a journey at all. And we worked really hard to counteract that, right? So to not only dig through the layers that, as you say, are absolutely in the text, Letitia in Cooley's original play is a fascinating, flawed, dimensional young woman. I did not need to do anything to make that happen. It was all right there for me. My job was to try to rise to meet it. But that same dimensionality did not seem to have been afforded Lady Frances, because it did not seem to have been considered a problem that she sort of stagnates as a character and flatlines and just accepts the things that happen to her. And so part of what has been so marvelous about the Digital Restoration series has been my opportunity to go in and actually change these plays and change the text and reframe certain stories, both for the specific ethoses and talents of the actors I have at my disposal, but also to try to afford a kind of complexity and multidimensionality and humanity to people, to those characters who don't get it, or don't get their just amount of it. And so Jill, as our stage manager of the Stratagem Project, what was it like for you going on that rollicking journey? And how do the two plays to you seem to speak to each other? Or what did you learn about the 18th century by putting them in conversation?
Yeah, so it's funny, when you kind of called us back to Claire the last time we did a deep dive, I remember talking, I was like, yep, my highlighters and like notepads are at the ready. And like now we're on the other side of it, and I was like, oh yeah, they really were at the ready. I think I burned through a couple pens, some highlighters, got all dried up. Because so from like a practical approach to it, it was lovely going through, because we had the same actors doing both pieces. Claire, at the beginning, we did both read-throughs. We did Beau's one afternoon, and literally the next day we did Belle's. Yep. And then Claire made it very clear at the very top of the process is like, we will be talking about the two pieces, sort of like, and how they inspire or talk to each other. So that was lovely, because the first week or so of rehearsals, it very much was that. And it was kind of just this fluid space of we're now going to talk about this duo in Beau's, and then these same actors are playing this duo in Belle's. And I remember, just as like a case study example, Caroline Haraldson and Ron Roma Melendez, who played Cherry and Archer in Beau's, there was one rehearsal where it was very much just the two of them, and then we shifted into their Savile and Kitty, and just to watch the actors be like, oh my goodness, like 70 years apart in these characters, and the way you wrote them, Claire, with their voices in mind too. There was just so much being learnt and explored in two different plays at the same time. Like it was very cool. So that was kind of like the intro to Stratagem Project, was very much this volleying between both pieces and ironing out, what both stories mean, and all that stuff. And then we got into just the more like practical, right? We're going tech week into Beau's. So then we kind of put Belle's aside for a hot second, focused on Beau's. But then we had a pickup rehearsal for Belle's in the week of Tech Week for
Yeah.
Bose. And that was cool too, because
And we did
that was
we did the masquerade.
it was
We
the
did, like, the
masquerade,
big
right?
scene. Yeah.
Yeah, it was a very technical, like, we need to do the scene now so that everyone can like digest it, sit with it, know that we're going there, because that's like the scene for Bells, right?
Yeah.
So and it was cool because at that point I feel like everyone, cast and creatives, was very much like, in the snap of a finger we can switch gears. Because throughout January, like, people's chemistries were already present, right? Because a lot of them had worked on Man of Mode or Rover or Way of the World, which is a lovely thing about DRS, right? Is we've picked up on each other's ethos and etc. But then it was just like, through this, we knew it was going to be a 10-week intensive, the same folks. By the end of January, we were like, yep, let's throw us in a scene, right? Or like, let's pivot, let's go here. Yeah, so then Bose ended, and then we got to Bells, and now that's going to take me to like talking about how both pieces very much influence and inspire each other, but they're very different. And we were talking about how Bose is a bit more like romp-esque, right? There's slapstick comedy going on. There's the amount of space that Ron took up in Archer's Zoom square was just bonkers. And like, his physical space started shifting too, right? He started like moving curtains. And then we get to Bells, which is like this like glittery breath of like effervescence and
romance. It's a really, really romantic play. Yeah.
Right. And but then so it was like, both Bose and Bells, their like cloaks were different, right? Like, Bells, like I said, had more of like an effervescence about the whole piece, but then there was like that comedy and that like the what's the word I'm trying to say? Like, the just I guess like the rawness that like Bose cloak would be. Bose cloak was kind of like, the overall theme is like kind of like crazy, a little kooky, but then like the romance embedded in that. So it was like Amwell and Dorinda were kind of the ethos of Bells, but they were like a character in it, right? Whereas, and then other Bells characters were like the ethos of Bose. I don't even know if I'm making sense now, but so yeah, and then just knowing that Bose was the early 1700s and then Bells was the late 1700s. Like, prior to doing the DRS, I knew of these plays, but I never would have thought, right, like tying them back to history, how they would have inspired or talked to each other. And that was another huge thing, Claire, that you baked into the Stratagem project, is like the in-between, right? Like the middle part of the 1700s, and like with the Licensing Act and like all the shift in power, and how the like society became more conservative. And like we were talking about, the women and people, but women especially, were like blasted onto the stage in the late 1600s and early 1700s, and like everything was a bit more like risque or
permissive,
sexualized, permissive, right? Exactly. And then that all shifts kind of mid 1700s, and now the late 1700s, we're back in the same, for women at least, back in the same boat of now we're in sentimental comedy. So like, there's morality needs to take first place here, right? And a lot of that, the female roles now become subservient again, because like that's their role in what society ended up being. And so that was like an interesting and sometimes like difficult shift, I would imagine, like for our actors too, of going from that sort of firework energy that Bose was, to now have to kind of go a little bit more like internal and sort of follow a guideline almost, right? Like towards freedom, as opposed to having freedom present.
Yeah. Bryson and I talked about it, because Bryson played the two bad husbands. he played the husband in Beau's Stratagem that Mrs. Sullen cannot stand, who is drunk all the time and is just a alternately negligent or kind of mean spouse, and is someone that she is sort of shackled to, and Mrs. Sullen is this firebrand of a young woman. She's smart. She's she's snarky. She has a really kind of like world weary gravitas to her. She was played in, beautifully by Sarah Linares, with Spanish, the Spanish language threaded through. And there was real fire and fury in her Mrs. Sullen, and understandably, because her husband was terrible. And in that play, Mrs. Sullen, in classic Restoration form, cuckolds him, right? First she seduces a French count who happens to be staying at the inn. I don't know. It's the play is ridiculous. There's like French people around, but she seduces a French count, and then actually emotionally falls in love with Archer, who visits her late at night by hiding in her closet. And it's hijinks, right? It's Restoration, romantic, sexual hijinks. She is allowed to strain against her marriage vows in these different ways, physically with a Frenchman, emotionally with Archer. And not only is she not punished for it, but at the end of the play, she gets to just sack her husband and take Archer as a lover. And that is celebrated in the text and in the world, because that was enabled and allowed and enjoyed by late Restoration audiences. Even in 1707, when they were starting to get a little more wary, they still loved that kind of thing. We then shift to 1780, where Bryson again is playing the bad husband of Sir George Touchwood, and as Claire Whitman said, did beautiful, graceful, illuminating work on that man, and making sure that he did have a dimensionality and a humanity to him despite his actions. But his young wife, Lady Frances Touchwood, played by Claire, is not afforded any of the freedoms or alternate options to Mrs. Sullen. She is locked inside her house by her husband, forbidden from seeing people, forbidden from going outside or having fun or having even ideas of her own. And she in Cooley's original play has seemingly no feelings for Saville, the young man that she knew in the country who is in love with her. In my adaptation, I changed that. But even so, for her to stray outside of her marriage vow would have a social cost so far beyond Mrs. Sullen's, right? There is the permissiveness of the Restoration is gone, and therefore Lady Frances's marriage to a quote-unquote bad husband is a life sentence. There is no way out. There is no recourse for her. There is no emotional relief for her. And Claire, you used the word regress, right? And I think it's so apt and also sort of heartbreaking, right? Because there is a regression not only away from the freedoms of the women of the Restoration, but of just lifeboats, of just options for getting away or options for dealing with their bad marriages, because there's no allowance for that on the stage anymore. And so that was I think, Jill, I think you put your finger on it. I think it was hard for some of us to realize this is 70 years into the future. We should have, if anything, being saddled to a bad husband should have become more infrequent, and you should have had more opportunities for divorce by the late 18th century, right. And instead the opposite has occurred.
Well, another really interesting case study thing too is Sarah Linares and Sienna Brown, who played our leading ladies in the Beau stratagem. They were Dorinda and Mrs. Sullen, and as Claire was saying, they get their happy ending, right? They get their freedom, and
they get their boys.
Yeah, they get their boys, and we see both of those characters really coming into their own, and they did that, right? It's very much their doing, their agency, and then they go on to play Mrs. Racket and Miss Ogle for us in Bell's Stratagem. And a lot of the time in rehearsal, I remember through Sarah and Sienna, which combined would be like Sierra, which
that's their couple name. That's their couple name.
I love that so much. But with Sarah and Sienna, I remember them being like, oh my goodness, because they very much were sort of like, I don't want to say motherly, but they were kind of like the guiding light for like Letitia and Lady Frances in this piece, because Mrs. Racket, right, she was like our widow, and in that, when I know we've talked about this on another deep dive too, but like widows had like a certain sense of power and status. Claire, you can probably go more about this, but because they received their husband's money, and like they were just allowed to kind of have that status, and so it's a little bit like thumbs up, good, like you have agency in a very male dominated world. But like you could tell, like both Mrs. Racket and Miss Ogle, they kind of knew the way of London, right? Knew the ways, they knew their place, and they also knew very much like the do's and don'ts of society, and they were kind of like fairy godmothers. We talked about that for like Letitia in particular, but even for Lady Frances. And I just remember Sarah and Sienna being like, wow, it's so interesting how like it seems as if it's Dorinda and Mrs. Sullen, right? Fast forward 70 years, because at the end of Bose, their friendship, right? They end up being sisters, or like, yeah, like sisterly, right? And so connected, and definitely like soulmates at the end of that piece. And then they kind of come as a package deal to kind of be the fairy godmothers for Letitia and Lady Frances. Yeah, and yeah, as a reminder of, you know, like I said, they still didn't have that freedom, but they were kind of a reminder for Lady Frances and Letitia, like, don't settle, don't, you know, or try your darndest to get what you want in a world that is now impossible to do so, but kind of like have faith, have hope. They were very much. But I mean, I guess both Claires, like what was your sort of response to those characters? I'd be so interested to know more about that.
Oh, I want Claire Whitman to talk about this, because your first scene on stage is a scene in which we meet Miss Ogle. We've already met Mrs. Racket. She's Letitia's young, cool, hip aunt cousin thing. So we've already met her. We haven't met Miss Ogle, but your first scene with them, Claire, is one of the most amazing scenes in that play.
I think one of the most important sort of dramaturgical functions of Mrs. Racket and Miss Ogle in that scene is that up until they introduce to her the notion that her situation is unfair, she is to some degree unaware of it. Yeah. She understands the emotional implications that this has within her, but the notion that other people can see it too, that, you know, I'm not crazy to think that me not being allowed to leave the house is perhaps not typical. And I think she greatly looks up to them. And what is it? Oh, a fine lady. Mrs. Racket has this beautiful, brilliant speech about what it means to be a fine lady, which contrasts a speech given by Sir George on the same topic. Yep. And in this description of a fine lady, Lady Frances sees what she herself wants to be, someone who has friends and is a part of the greater world of London. And it is only by that being shown to her in a positive light that she is encouraged to reach for it. And were it not for their friendship and their encouragement, she might never have left the house. Because one of the things that is spoken of, that she's been in London nearly 2 weeks and hasn't once left her house until they come to sort of rescue her. And she even has a moment of faltering of saying, no, I should stay and do as I'm told. And they give her courage. And I guess that sort of reflects back to what I've said about the community of women. Yeah. Is that it is that support that allows Letitia and Lady Frances to make their bolder decisions, because they are supported in that.
Beautiful. Yeah, and later on, later on in the play, when Lady Frances and Savile and Mrs. Racket are all together, I knew that I wanted to give Savile and Frances a French scene, which means a scene in which no one enters or exits. It's just, I wanted to give a scene was just the two of them alone. And I didn't know how. Like, I struggled so much. I was like, how do I do this? Because this would never have been allowed. And how do I justify it, right, in the sequence of Cooley's events? And I was like, Mrs. Racket she is that advocate. She is that girl power friend who would absolutely pick up on the vibes in the room, that these are two people who are passionately attracted to each other. And she would be like, I'm not allowed to leave them alone, but I will. And I felt that decision, even though, again, it's not in Cooley's text, I was inventing the scene, I felt that decision was justified in what we saw and heard from Racket in the rest of the play. I didn't feel that was I didn't feel that was a bridge too far for her. And I think Sarah, Sarah is a genius and brilliant at everything, but I think there was something special about her Racket, because I think Sarah has been a Mrs. Racket to a lot of us. I think she has been a cool big sister who tells us that we're worth it and worth more in real life. There is some of that energy about her as a person. And so I think playing Racket was something of a triumph for her, because she felt like she could bring so much of herself to it. And that is certainly how I felt about Letty. And for better and for worse. I'm not saying I'm some great heroine. I'm saying, like, her messiness really resonated with me, and I felt like it was such a joy to be able to tap into that brash and obstinate and determined and micromanagerial part of myself and explore it. But I think for Sarah, there was really this kind of there was this certainty to her Racket of, like, I am a widow now. I'm married. I did the right thing, society. I married a rich man. I did it. You can't fault me. He died. Not my fault. Now I have his money. Now I, under the law, am considered a human being. Now I have my own property, right? These were the rights afforded to widows. And she's like, instead of remarrying, I am going to wield this power, this additional privilege, and I'm going to lift up the women in my life. And the power of that. Like, we performed it in March, which was Women's History Month. I'm getting goosebumps just talking about it. There was something so kismet-like, I think, about doing it. And actually, Emily, because you were with us at first read and you were there at the finish line on the day of performance, what were the plays to you, like, as a viewer?
Yeah, I feel like I got a really special relationship with the Stratagem Project because I got to watch the first read, and then, of course, I got to watch the final performance. And there were a few times where I got to play Mrs. Sullen and Mrs. Racket, I think, once as well, because I filled in for Sarah a few times when she wasn't able to come. And I really like. I think my biggest takeaway from this project was just the joy in both of these plays. They're both just so genuinely fun. And I think that they were a perfect project to do at that point in the DRS because, I will be the first one to say that Restoration plays are not easy to understand the first time you read them. And I think that there was this process of the way of what am I trying to say here? Of the sort of the order that we read these plays, of like working on more complex and more intricate plays, like starting out with one that's really, really accessible, Way of the World, that is like from moment one, you know exactly what all of these characters are doing. And then going into the Rover and Man of Mode, where they're starting to get a little bit more complicated and dark also. And the Stratagem Project, I think both of these plays they have really complex characters, really complex motives. But by that point, we're so familiar with I felt at least that I was familiar enough with the Restoration genre and with the types of like stock characters that we'll see. And so that we could see like how Cooley was tugging on those stock characters a little bit and trying to like put them in some kind of like new forms for us to see, that we could really enjoy all of that and really like dig into the story. I think that they were some of the most fun shows that we had done. That and Love for Love, I think, like, I really think of those three, like specifically Belle's Stratagem and Love for Love, I really think of as being just like brilliantly fun shows that are enjoyable to watch and and funny, that really sticks with me.
Yay! Oh, you warmed my heart. And actually, it's so funny you say that, because Bell's Stratagem was inspired in part by William Congreve's Love for Love, which is why we did our table read of Love for Love with the cast of Congreve's Way of the World in January, in the midst of Stratagem. That was very intentional on my part. It was because Cooley that was her favorite play. She loved Love for Love.
I get it.
Yeah, she loved Love for Love, and there is so much of Love for Love that she is directly culling for the Bell's Stratagem. Angelica, the Congreve's heroine of Love for Love, who I had the honor of reading for, is running a stratagem in that play that nobody knows about. It's not until the very last moments of the play, when she rips up the legal document that would curse Valentine to poverty, and says, "I loved you all along. I've been testing you," that you realize that everything she has done has been a part of this elaborate scheme. And all that Cooley does is she just centers Angelica as the protagonist. But it's the same kind of character with the same kind of, devious machinations that are truly born from a place of love. And Valentine, Hannah Cooley called Doracourt my Valentine, and they didn't know what she meant at first, and scholars eventually came to realize she was saying, this is my spin on Congreve's character Valentine, the lead of Love for Love, who Ben also read for, and then read for Doracourt. And there are just so many things from, the fact that the lead, right, that he pretends to be mad, she takes that from Love for Love, like straight from it. The fact that there is an old patriarch who is like, I can foresee things. That's foresight in Love for Love. That's Hardy in Bell's Stratagem, right? So Hannah Cooley was so inspired by that play, which actually, in this edition of Congreve, the editor, Eric S. Rump, he says that Love for Love is Congreve's sunniest play, that there's a lot of sun in that play. And I think there's a lot of sun in the Bell's Stratagem as well.
Yeah, I really agree with that.
And so it was fun doing that reading in January and then diving into Bell's Stratagem, because I think for a lot of us, we were like, oh, like, we know this. Like, there's Congreve here. And they're both delightful and whimsical and accessible, as you say. The thing about Way of the World, which, I mean, you said, we sort of started there, and you called it accessible. You might be the only actor in human history to call that play immediately accessible, Emily. And I don't know if that's just because you're a genius or because the rest of us are really slow, because that play is famously convoluted and complex. But I do think that his characters are, because they're so human and complete, that maybe that makes it like easier to step into. But I would love to hear you talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, I think what I meant by accessible is that I think that Way of the World feels like a contemporary play, in that each of the characters, you can kind of frame each character as the protagonist. I think that all of them are a little bit morally gray. Like, there are definitely the sort of more, I would say, good characters and the more evil characters, but I feel like typically in a Restoration comedy, you have some pretty distinct classes of characters.
Sure.
You have the lovers, you have the, like the manipulators and the schemers. And I feel like, and that I think is something that as a reader you can really rely on to understand the play, is be like, all right, like, I know that this character is going to eventually end up with this character, and we just need to see how they get there. Right. Whereas Way of the World, I think, feels very out of its own time, in that it feels more contemporary, and you can really relate with Mrs. Fainall, and you can really like see, I think, some you can really see some like empathy and tragedy in Marwood, even though she's kind of like one of the like more evil characters. And I think that's what I mean by accessible, in that it feels more familiar. Like, there are plenty of contemporary plays that aren't accessible, in that the characters don't have clear motives.
Yeah.
But but I feel like that's very much a feature of contemporary drama, is like, what is going on with these characters? What do they want? Who do we relate with the most? Maybe it's all of them. Maybe it's none of them. And I think that Way of the World has kind of that contemporary quality that's very surprising to read in a 18th century play.
Absolutely. Oh, thank you so much for that. I would completely agree. And because we hadn't done our reading yet the last time we talked, I think we should talk about it. So we did a reading of The Way of the World at the end of January. Some of us were carryover actors from our audio drama from last summer. And then there were a couple of newbies to The Way of the World, but longtime DRSers, right? Like Ron. And we did a longer cutting of the play, and it was kind of a proof of concept reading. And those of us like Emily and I who were reading for the same character we had played before. I don't know about you, Em. I found it a fascinating and moving experience. Like, it was a really special afternoon. Like, I count it as one of my favorite single days we've had in the DRS, because I think we were doing something that you rarely get to do as an actor or an artist, which is return to a play, return to a character several months later with more text and the added benefit of having months of time in the interim to get to know your scene partners, to work on other plays. Like, it wasn't like we set aside The Way of the World after the summer and then went and lived our separate lives and then came back and did a reading. We had been working with each other consistently. You played Marwood with Ron as Fainall. Well, you had played Helena and Wilmore for me in the meantime. It's not like you didn't know each other. And so I'd love to hear you talk about it, Em, and then I'd love to hear Jill talk about it as well, because you were there for it. And I would love to hear what it was like for you to watch it. And I think, Claire Whitman, you've at least seen half of it, I think. Yeah. So I'd love to hear from you, too, because you sort of all three have different perspectives on it. But let's start with Emily. What was it like reading for Marwood again?
Yeah, well, you said it exactly what I was thinking, which is that it is so rare that you get to spend, in the original production that was in August, we had 2 weeks of rehearsal, but they were 2 intensive weeks of rehearsal. So it was every single day. And so it was it was almost like a retreat. Like, I kind of felt like we got to go into Way of the World and then come out of it on the other end, versus the DRS model now, which is much more sustainable and for the world that isn't just like the summer, but we have usually 6 or 7 weeks to really think about a show and have more spaced out rehearsals. So it was this very intensive period, and it was very because of that, it felt like running a sprint. Like, it was like day one you get a scene, and by the next day, like, I hope you figured out I hope I've figured out what's going on in the scene, and if I haven't, I hope it comes to me in the moment, because that's the time that we have. And I felt like during that run, the idea of who I wanted my Marwood to be was still developing as we were finishing up the show. And it was really like the last day of recording where I was like, oh, I think she actually doesn't want what I thought she wanted at all. Like, I think that she wants this other thing. And then being able to really think about that for the next couple of months, and really contemplate that, and like have the script. And we didn't know at this point that there was going to be another reading. It was kind of just like, maybe once this pandemic is over, we'll do this play in person, kind of dreaming in the future. So yeah, being able to return to it is such a rare opportunity as an actor, a character that you've spent some really intensive time on, but kind of like both extreme ends of the spectrum, in that we had this short, intensive sprint period and then a long self-guided period. And we got to have both of those, which you almost never get. Usually you just get one or the other. And then to get to return to the characters. And yeah, again, it was very special to have kind of, a lot of it was the same dynamic. We had a lot of familiarity with each other, but with enough like new text and new actors that it got to change up. And also by this point, feeling a little bit more comfortable and aware of what to do in a digital space and what can be done in a digital space. It's hard to remember this now, but back in August when we were rehearsing this play, we had done maybe like 2 readings before. So we were still like just trying to figure out how to get onto Zoom at this point. And I think we did a great job with what we had done, but we'd only been in the pandemic for 3 months at that point, which is also great. 4 months. And yeah, so it was a very special experience and something very rare as an actor. It kind of felt like a callback to like the more like repertory company days of theater, where you have these people that you know really well, but each time you work with them, you get to work with them in a different way and under different dynamics. You get to like pull these things that you can kind of see in your fellow actors out of them that you maybe didn't get to see in the other productions. It was great. I loved working on it.
Thank you. I agree. And I think I did a tally this morning. There have been 54 actors thus far that have lent their voices to at least one thing from the DRS. 54 artists have read for at least one character at least one point. And that goes for table reads as well as audio dramas. But there are 12 of you, 12 of us who have done 80% of the projects or more. And Emily, you're one of those people. To start, when we did Way of the World, we didn't know there was going to be a DRS. And so feels like it felt very, it was really moving for me to go back to my favorite play. Way of the World is my favorite play, and Congreve is my favorite playwright. It was very moving to return to that story that I love with all my heart. That is like, it's a comedy of manners that has so much tragedy in it and so much realism in it. And it seems, as you said, Emily, it seems to transcend time, and it seems to transcend categorization or genre, or it seems to transcend the Restoration itself. Like, it was so moving to come back to it, not only having the chemistries and the bonds with the actors in a kind of repertory way, as you said, Emily, because we'd all been working together pretty consistently, but also to have all that experience with Congreve's contemporaries. To me, it was similar to, like, if you do a Shakespeare play and then you spend a lot of time doing Shakespeare's contemporaries. You do your Marlowe and you do your Fletcher and your Massinger, and then 6 months later, after working with the same group of actors, you come back to a Shakespeare play. And you're like, oh, wow, this can be so meaningful. This we can mine so much together. And we can, like, go to this archaeological dig and, like, really work, like, we know what we're doing here. We have our tools. And now we get to really test out our faculties on this incredibly difficult, intricate, exquisite play. And I mean, yeah, I found it really, like, just a really special afternoon. So Jill, how was it for you? Because you weren't with us the first time we did Way of the World, but you listened to it and then you knew all of it really well.
Right. And this is so fascinating because Emily just kind of brought this to the surface for me of both instances for y'all, like, reading Way of the World or recording Way of the World was under either, like, at a time, right, under like a tight timeline, or sandwiched in between a tight timeline. Because when we did the second reading of Way of the World, it was the end of January, and as I talked about, like, the practicality of the Stratagem project, that was, like, arguably probably our busiest week in our 10-week sort of Stratagem project land. And I remember it was a Sunday afternoon, and we had something that weekend as well.
We had dry tech.
I can't recall exactly. Right, dry tech, exactly. And so it was like, we're doing the reading of Way of the World, we're putting it in, like, this is the day that everyone can do it. And it was at, like, a high stress time for the Stratagem project. So it's just fascinating to me that both, even the actors, like, for the actors returning from the original audio drama, you were kind of both in the same sort of, like, I don't want to say stress, but, like, under the wire vibe, right? That, like, the audio drama would have been, and then also what the read is. And it's just, again, going back to what Emily said, like, the Way of the World, to me, it's unlike a Rover, for instance, where Rover has, like, larger groups of actors on stage at a time, or there's, like, fight sequences, right? The mechanics of that one is a bit more, you kind of have to go through and mechanically dot your I's, cross your T's. Whereas the Way of the World, it really is reliant upon these relationships and, like, the depths of the characters and how, and kind of going at it that way, like doing character work sort of in the mind versus on the feet first, right? And so it's so cool to me. I'm just realizing this now, that in the snap of a finger, y'all were like, we're now reading the Way of the World. And the the like explosion of chemistry and I know a lot of that had to do with a lot of people were DRSers, right, for that second reading of Way of the World. So like you were saying, we had that time to sort of work with each other, know how each other tick, know how, like this person's going to deliver this line this way. So like, I'm pretty sure I'll be able to retort this way. And then kind of having that workshop space be like allowed. So I think that was the big thing for me is, I guess the conclusion of all this is both experiences, y'all were under like some sort of pressure or wire, and both experiences you were working on each other. But with the second reading, because it was packed with knowing each other and knowing how each other tick, it was almost like I was watching a different play. Yeah. And I know a lot, like I said, some of the people weren't the originals. So obviously like characters might have been delivered differently. But overall, I think thematically, you are all giving each other a playground and a space. And like Emily was saying, like that's very rare for that to happen, right? In a process, it's either you either get one or the other, right? So hearing the audio drama of Way of the World, and also by hearsay, what that process was like for all of you who were involved in the audio drama process. And then like being able to watch and be a part of the read, it was magical. Just how it's like, it's the same piece, but it really is, it blossomed into this other thing. Like like the characters' depths were expanded even more than I thought they could, yeah, it was fascinating. It was almost like an external look into like how evident it really is when you work with the same actors in arguably the hardest genre of theater history, right? And you sort of masterclass each other, and then here is sort of a byproduct result, right?
And you had the unique experience of only hearing the audio drama, which is just aural, and then you got to watch us. You got to see our faces as we looked at each other. And that was something that was really particularly like astonishing to me, because I had been on screen with the actors rehearsing The Way of the World, but for the entire post-production process, right, of editing it, curating it into a radio play, I was just listening. And I remember, I think in part because Fainall was in many ways very different from the other roles Ron had played for us in the DRS. I mean, Ron primarily has been our like rake. He's been our libertine. And Fainall is a rake, among other things. But Fainall is a hot fucking mess. And is really, he's positioned in the story as the antagonist, but absolutely thinks of himself as the protagonist and has lots of reasons to. And is very morally complex, because even though he does atrocious things and says atrocious things about his wife, he is desperately in love with Marwood, who is in love with someone else. And the pain of that, the raw agony of that is its own kind of tragedy and not really his fault. But it was very different. Like, that's very different than a Wilmore or a Dorimant or an Archer. And I feel like just listening would have been powerful enough, but it was seeing him on screen working with you, Emily, that was really like, that chemistry became even more apparent, and the tragedy and raw rage of that character became so much more terrifying because I could see it in his face, and I could see the effect of it in your face. And I think that I don't know for you, Jill, but like for me, I found the story became that much more impactful because I could see people's faces as other people were speaking.
Oh my goodness. Yeah, and it's funny because I know when we talk about The Way of the World, Claire, you say like these characters have such a depth. There's so many layers to each character, and that's part of the reason why it's one of your favorite pieces. And it's just funny now talking of it's like hearing it, right, and then seeing it. Now I feel like I've had a taste of The Way of the World in these two completely opposite, well, not completely opposite, but opposite mediums, right? Like an audio drama and then a visual sort of Zoom interaction of it. And now I want to see it on stage, because I think, again, if it's blossoming with each of these sort of tiers, holy moly, like the stage production, right? Yeah, it's I guess it's a positive takeaway of this pandemic thing of we're able to kind of explore art in different mediums, and then sort of see what impact that has on the overall product. Right?
I set out with the goal that the digital restoration series would be an all virtual exploration of restoration, 18th century and 18th century drama, centered and spotlighted on the way that this theater changed theater itself in the late 16th and 17th centuries, but also the way that themes of, politics, sex, feminism, economic stratification, the way that these themes were being excavated and reinterpreted by Restoration and 18th century writers, but also the way that those themes continue to manifest, and matter to us today. I wanted to look at the relevance and resiliency of these stories and structures and ideas. I wanted to unearth and explore. I think that one of my greatest takeaways from it, now that we are in what we would sort of would be the last phase of the DRS, what I'm realizing is that this process has made me realize the potentiality of Restoration and 18th century drama. We have not tapped it. We have not, we have not run it dry. I don't feel like I have run out of inspiration or excitement about these plays. I don't feel like I have come to I don't feel like I have discovered everything about all of them, or that I have reached some sort of conclusion or catharsis with any of them. Instead, how I feel is that I have learnt to appreciate the wealth of opportunity that lives inside of them, right? This DRS has made me aware that, there is so much here. And when we are able and allowed to do theater again in person, the old-fashioned way, these plays will be at the top of my list. They have to be, because there is only so much you can do on Zoom. There is only so much you can do in a radio play. And while these were our options, while these were our mediums, of course we were going to take them by the throat and give it our all and do as much as we can. And I celebrate and appreciate and almost worship that fact, right? That we just decided we're going to make the most of the mediums that we have. But at the same time, I think the reading of The Way of the World proved to me that there is still so much further to go, and that once we are able to do theater in person again, there will be so much further to go with all of these plays, starting with The Way of the World, which is a play that I think in person will be just that much more gut-wrenching, but also funny, but also romantic, but also, nuanced and full of complexity. I feel like that's going to be one of my major takeaways from this whole process has been the DRS has opened up or perhaps unlocked the potential energy of these plays. Mm-hmm. But in no way have we exhausted it. In no way have we gotten to, have we scraped the bedrock of any of these pieces yet. We have only discovered how much joy and adventure and messiness and relevancy is contained inside of them. And so once we are let loose on the stages again, it will be so much fun to dig that much further and go that much deeper, and add that humanism and immediacy of heartbeats in rooms, right, to the magic that is already there. Claire Whitman, what was it like for you to watch the part of Way of the World that you did, having been sort of just an audience member for this one?
It strikes me, and I fear I shall just repeat your very eloquent notions. I think it was this relationship between Marwood and Fainall which struck me most, both as being a very contemporary set of circumstances, and characters that would not seem out of place in any modern drama, but also as a curious reversal of some of the other things that we've seen in context of the rest of the DRS, to hear a man rage against the institution of marriage, which has not served him the way it seems to be serving many of his contemporaries, was an exciting possibility. And I think, something that we've talked a lot about in sort of our playwriting ventures, Claire, is Lauren Gunderson's notion of the character-defining choice and the character-defining action. Yeah. And I think that is hyper-present in The Way of the World, but also in all of these Restoration and 18th century pieces, is that by the end of the play, every character must decide, who am I and what will I do about it? Often in spite of a society that is not always accepting of who people are, preferring a sort of imagined ideal. And indeed, sometimes in spite of the texts themselves, which are asking for an imagined ideal. And so we as actors get to make that decision for our characters. Who am I and what shall I do about it? And I think that's been sort of my favorite through line of the whole DRS.
Oh, I love that. Thank you, Claire. And I think, Marwood in many ways is one of the critical agents of Way of the World. She is one of the catalysts for so much of that action, which is why I think, Emily, you're totally right in positing that you could make an argument. You could write a dissertation arguing that she is the real protagonist of that play. Her actions, or at least her ideas that spur others to action, is what engenders so much of the conflict and action of that piece. And it really isn't over until it's over with her. She fights to the bitter end. And I think that those are my favorite plays. I love plays where not only is it sometimes unclear who the main protagonist is, but you almost don't care who the main protagonist is because you're so interested and invested in the who am I, what am I doing of everyone else in the story. I love ensemble pieces. I love pieces where everyone gets a moment in the spotlight. Everyone gets their time to shine. Everyone gets gets to experience a critical juncture, and every character has to decide something that is ultimate and transformative, for better or for worse. And I think one of the many, many things that set Congreve apart from his Restoration and early 18th century contemporaries is the fact that he was committed to giving every single actor in all of his casts that kind of centering and that kind of attention and that kind of care. And I think for me, as someone who has been rewriting a lot of these scripts and reframing them and recontextualizing them for the actors that I've been working with, that the generosity of that and the intentionality of that really resonates with me because I have tried to do it myself, right? I have striven to afford everyone that's in every cast something that is challenging and meaty and something, I've tried to give everyone, every character in each show their moment to define themselves. And I think that in Congreve's plays, in The Way of the World, in Love for Love, we are going to be closing out the Digital Restoration series with a reading of his very first play, The Old Bachelor. The thing that is amazing about his plays is the fact that they really do feel like ensemble dramas, dramedies, perhaps we would say, in which every character matters and everyone gets their time in front of the microphone and everyone makes choices that hurdles the story along. And you really do get a sense of the world, right? You get a sense of a community, and of all of the different types of people, and indeed all of the different types of women who inhabit our world. And that is joyful and truthful to me, and so much more interesting than star vehicles, right? I would always rather see a King Lear than a Hamlet. Because in King Lear, you get to know everyone, and you get to go everywhere, see everything. Everyone has some stake in the action. We are not just glued to one human. And I think one of the reasons that Restoration and 18th century comedy inspires me in particular is because I find that these plays are supremely aware of the power of the ensemble. and they afford us lots of different looks at life and lots of different perspectives through the mouths and voices and bodies of these different kinds of people who inhabit the world. So I think the last thing to talk about is the great question of what's next. So we are now deeply into the 18th century. We have been moving mostly chronologically in the DRS, but not entirely, but I tried. So we are now in the 18th century, and on Saturday, 6 days from now, oh my God, Jill, it's in 6 days, we are going to be hosting a full cast table read of The Times by Elizabeth Griffith, a late 18th century comedy of manners set in 1779 in London, that is, in many ways, the anti-Bell's Stratagem, because it is a play written by one of Cooley's contemporaries 1 year before she wrote Bell's Stratagem. They're both written by women, but oh my gosh, these plays could not be more different. So we're doing a reading of The Times on Saturday, and then the very next day, a week from today, on Sunday, May 9th, Mother's Day, sorry moms, we are beginning our final audio drama in the digital restoration series, Richard Brinsley Sheridan's exuberant The School for Scandal, written and first performed in 1777. It is one of the landmark pieces of English theater. To this day, it continues to be taught in schools, in undergraduate courses. It is a very, very, very famous, a very, very famous comedy of manners set in London at the height of the American Revolution. And it follows a group of gossip mongers who basically play out the late 18th century version of Mean Girls as kind of a salacious and exciting and snide backdrop to what amounts to a sort of insane, ridiculous family drama in which two young brothers battle it out for the love and fortune of a young heiress whose guardian and his young wife also become unwilling participants in that romantic what do we call it? I don't know what they're in. They hate each other. So in the race for Mariah's fortune, her guardian, Sir Peter Teazle, and his young wife, Lady Teazle, they become members of the chessboard as well, as these two brothers, kind of duke it out. So that is our last audio drama, and then we have two more table reads. We have an early 18th century play by Susanna Saint-Livre called The Busybody. Her delightful, whimsical rom-com about two young women who want to marry two young rakes against the wishes of their patriarchal authority figures. One is a father and one is a guardian, and so they commission a fop named Marplot to mar their father's plots and help
those restoration names are so creative
and help them,
they really don't leave any guesswork.
Help them marry the men that they choose. It is a wonderful, like, little proto-feminist romp, and then we're going to conclude with William Congreve's restoration comedy, The Old Bachelor, which he began writing when he was just 19 and still in law school, and finished it when he was 21 and had just dropped out to become a playwright. So we're gonna begin and end this whole DRS process with my boy Will Congreve. But in the meantime, we have these two wonderful table reads of 18th century plays by women, and this marvelous, amazing, dazzling, ridiculous, splendid, wacky comedy, The School for Scandal. So Claire Whitman is going to be playing our young ingenue heiress in both the Times reading on Saturday and in The School for Scandal. So, I mean, Claire, you can start wherever you'd like. You've read both plays. What are you looking forward to, and just how are you receiving Louisa and Mariah?
They are two characters who had more in common before the munificence of Claire Martin took pity on a poor actress and decided to give Mariah a little bit of the development that she is denied. And it's very curious to me of how commodified these women are. Mm-hmm. It is not just a question of her love, but of her fortune. And who is seen as worthy to receive one or both by the men in charge of her, and who she herself deems worthy of one or both. Mm-hmm. And, Louisa is sort of perhaps a refreshingly straightforward young woman. She wants to marry whom she wants to marry. And it is a clear objective that I think is sort of delightful, even though she is perhaps not quite so deeply complex and sort of a deep well as Lady Frances might be. I think she's made for the man that she wants to marry, in that they are both just sort of a heap of sentimental comedy heroes. And we were speaking of this the other day, that they will go on to have a perfectly lovely life talking about nothing in particular. And it's to see what depths can be plumbed in something so shallow. Mm-hmm. How to still make these people deeply lovable without them needing to go against what they were created to be, which are some perfectly lovely young people in a perfectly lovely love plot. And, and there are, I won't fully spoil it, but there are some moments where perhaps a deeper humanity shines through. And so I'm interested to see, how does it feel to be so deeply in the world of your sentimental comedy play, and then just for a moment to be shaken from it? Yeah. And the impact it has on the characters. So that's the Times. And in School for Scandal, I delight in having the chance to play someone perhaps not so placid as I often find myself in your reclamation of Mariah, and who is deeply aware of her commodification. She's deeply aware that her being is tied to the money that she has, and the ways that disempowers her and the ways that it empowers her. And what happens when she learns to claim that status. Something we talked about with Lady Frances is her lack of status, despite being, the wealthiest person, the most powerful woman in a room by society's dictates. Mariah is learning how to step into that power and to claim it for herself through your graceful interpretation. And I hope to do it justice.
Thank you. Oh, of course you will. Are you kidding? It was just intimidating for me to write for you. But I knew what I was doing a little bit better this time around, in part because you had played Lady Frances for me, and I also rewrote a lot of her text. But I rewrote almost all of Mariah's text, and I gave her a hell of a lot more than she is afforded in Sheridan's original play. I have changed that character more than I think I have changed any character in the DRS. I think in a lot of cases I have either reframed a character. In the case of Lady Frances, I reframed what is considered like a husband and a wife who just don't really understand each other, but will reconcile and be happy together forever, as this is a toxic, emotionally abusive marriage in which the woman comes to realize, I am being abused, and also I am allowed to have feelings for someone else, right? So I sort of reframed it and wrote text that just supported that deepening of her character. Sometimes when Emily played Emilia in The Man of Mode, Emily has an incredibly strong and vibrant, beautiful personality, but Emilia can come across in Etheridge's text as rather demure and insipid sometimes. Two things that Emily is not, nor does she read as. And so I wrote some lines for Emilia to just play up the parts of her that felt a little bit more subversive and playful, and to just kind of reify what I think Etheridge only suggests in moments. With Mariah in School for Scandal, I have just actually changed the character. And my apologies to anyone out there who's teaching this play to students or loves this play as is. I have completely changed the character. I've just made her into something else. And I have, as Claire said, I have tried to empower her by giving her an awareness of her commodification and objectification in the world of her play, right? In the world of London in 1777, by making her aware of that and by making her alternately disdainful and righteously angry about it. I think I have honored just the intelligence of young women in a way that Sheridan really doesn't. And also I have tried to honor the moral compass that he gives her, this determination to live in a way that is actually compassionate towards others and to be discreet, right? As opposed to perpetuating gossip without perpetuating gossip about other people and their travails without proof. She has chosen to refrain and hold back and not judge until there is evidence, which is a very noble thought. And I did not want to strip that from her, but I did not want her to be some holier than thou, like prissy little perfect angel doll with no flaws or personality, because that felt just as disingenuous to the truth of being a woman, even a quote unquote good woman. And so I've tried to play up some of the faults and flaws that I find in her. And I have also given her the chance to actually go head to head with the man that she is in love with, as a way of expressing her doubts and fears about their marriage, and also as a way of, trying to instill a realism to their romance that I don't think is there in the original. So I've just completely rewritten her. And I think that where I drew from, for the most part, was Congreve's heroines, because I have now played Millamant. I've played his Millamant, who is his great heiress. I've played Angelica, who is another one of his great heiresses. I will be playing Araminta, another great heiress. Like, he wrote the same role for Anne Bracegirdle, he just got better each time. And something that I love about Millamant, who is she should be our ingenue and way of the world. She is not quite that, and many other things as well. But one of the things I love about her is that she fully recognizes the power and potential danger of her position as a woman of great means, as an unmarried woman of great means, because she recognizes that what men seem to love about her may not be love at all, right? She recognizes that she is a bargaining chip before she is anything else. And she is aware that the moment she gets married, she will cease to become a human being under the law, and her husband will have full control of her money. And because of that, there is a wariness to the way that Millamant moves through the world. She affects a kind of, she affects an exterior of being impervious to affection, and she laughs at everything and doesn't take anything seriously, and it's all a complete front. It is a way of protecting herself from becoming attached to a man who will then, in all likelihood, cease to love her, screw other women, and just spend all of her money. And I think that for Mariah, where I started from, is I was like, what if she had more of Millamant's sensibility of who she is and how she fits into her world, and how the young men of her world would see her, right? And value her, right? So I actually gave her one of Millamant's lines as a way to sort of honor that that's where I'm pulling from. Nay, he has done nothing, he has only talked. I pulled that line from Way of the World and gave it to Mariah. It's the only line of hers I didn't write myself, but I think it's a way of calling out the inspiration for her new incarnation in this piece. And you're going to do such beautiful work with it, Claire. Like, I can't wait to see your take on this character, because there is a natural sweetness to you and a natural good intentionality that I think will still make Mariah the lovely ingenue that we root for and that we want to be happy. But at the same time, there will also be a messiness to her and a dimensionality to her that I think will be surprising to people and will make her ending that much more triumphant, because she feels as real as her counterpart, Charles Surface, who's a very richly defined character. And yeah, I'm very excited for that process. And Jill, it's your last audio drama to stage manage. How are you feeling about that?
I know. I'm feeling excited. Like we talked about, it's going to be nice just kind of launching off of Venice Preserved into a comedy again. I think that's going to be that breath of fresh air that was a bit stifled due to Venice Preserved's darkness in the last couple weeks.
Yeah.
So it'll be good to kind of jump and then jump into one that like we talked about. It's such an installment in training and stuff like that, right? Like this and the Rover, I would say, are ones that are very commonly known and tackled both theoretically and practically. So it's going to be good to kind of end on one that like not only our actors but even audience members, there's some sort of familiarity in that too. And then like I always am so excited, Claire, to see what you've done to the piece and how that kind of changes people's interpretation or how they go about the text. Something that's really going to be very cool with the rest of like this audio drama and the rest of our table reads is we have some actors that haven't been with us since the beginning of the DRS. We have some sort of DRS newbies coming in and spicing things up. So it's in a way, it's kind of like the second wave of the DRS, even though it's the second half of the DRS as well. So I think it's going to be really neat to see energies, like different energies kind of add to scenes and add to the rehearsal space and the table reads and such. So we're getting some fresh faces, even though it's the end of the DRS. We're adding. I mean, Claire, do you know by chance like how many actors we will have by the end? Like probably nearly 100 at least, right? That have blended at least.
I think we'll have about 60. I think we'll have about 60.
But still, like that. That's
wow.
Just, when you said that stat, that behooved me. It was like, oh my goodness, that's so true. But yeah, so that I'm really looking forward to that, and I'm looking forward to. This is probably going to sound nerdy, but anytime, we segue from spring to summer, there's also an energy, right, that's spiked. Everyone's kind of getting out in the sunshine or turning new leaves kind of. And so I think that's going to add some light to the end of our road here, which is so odd to say. But I'm really looking forward to jumping in to this last little leg.
The School for Scandal is joyful. It is joyful. It is big. It is a bit like the Bow Stratagem in that I don't think that it is as emotionally complex, and I don't think that the characters are as unbelievably full and fleshed out and remarkably human as they are in, say, A Way of the World, right? Or just any of Congreve's other plays. But its broadness is part of what makes it so delightful, because it just doesn't ever take itself too seriously as a show. And I think that, again, I guess as you say, after the darkness of Venice, to be able to hurl ourselves into a play and a world that is just ridiculous, that where the characters are just absurd and larger than life, and everyone is just foppish and witty and decadent, and where there are these absolutely insane scenes, right? Like there's a very famous scene in a gallery, a portrait gallery, where the young man Charles Surface, who will be played by Ben Apple, who's been with us since the beginning, he is completely out of cash, and as a kind of as a way of getting money from this moneylender who is actually his secret uncle in disguise. Like I said, it's a weird play. He has decided that he is going to sell all of the paintings of his ancestors, because he's from this like long established rich family. So they're like walking down the hallway, and he's like, "This is my uncle such a one who fought in this famous battle and was a complete coward, but he looks really nice in his military uniform. Like, can I interest you in this portrait?" And then anytime he sells one, his friend goes and knocks it off the wall after him, and they just go down the portrait gallery with his friend Carolus just banging portraits off the walls. Like, it's an insane play. It's ridiculous. But I think that's part of what makes it so enjoyable. And we have a giant cast. We have 15 people plus Jill and I plus our assistant stage managers, and we have 2 swing actors who will be stepping in on occasion. Like, it's a big sprawling family that we are sort of ending with. And as Jill said, some of us have been here from the very beginning, like Ben, who is Mirabelle in Way of the World and has been here from literally day one, to certain actors who are brand new. This is going to be their first audio drama with us. Some Canadians. Thank you, Jill, for recommending some of your friends. We're expanding our Great White Way representation. And we get to, I think we really do get to go out with a bang, right? In the most delightful and dynamic and perfect way. We get to go out of this project with a bang. And all three of our table reads that are upcoming are all comedies. And they all end well. And the girl gets what she wants in the end. And I wouldn't want to end this process any other way. I wouldn't want the end of our line to look any different. I want it to be whimsical and breezy and romantic and fun and, superficial and funny and all of the things that restoration is, all of the things it can represent to us about the power of community and the power of comedy. And I think that School for Scandal in many ways encapsulates all of that, but also because it is set and written in 1777, the play also represents the legacy of the Restoration, right? We are 100 years later. This is 100 years after Restoration theater. And it still lives, and it is still present, and the writers of the late 18th century are still moved and inspired by it, and are still investigating it, and trying to figure out, well, what does it mean for us now, which is what we have been doing in our modern space with the Restoration. What do we do with this? What does this mean for us now? We are the Sheridans of the 21st century, right? We are the Cooleys, the Griffiths. We are doing this work now. And we're trying to figure out how everything that we have done can matter, or perhaps matter in a new way, in the world that we are living in now. And that is exactly what they did at the end of the 18th century. They looked back to the Restoration and they said, what can we take? What can we steal from that? What do we want? What might be good to go back to? And how might we bring it forward? And what does that mean to us today? And so I think that ending in 1777 is also really important, because if the DRS is about the legacy of the Restoration for the 21st century, School for Scandal is about the legacy of the Restoration for the long 18th. And so that's where we're leaving it. So you might see some of us one more time, but this is the end of the line. So the last thing I want to do before we sign off for today. Well, two things. One, I want to hear from all of you again, and then we'll let Emily do her big announcement. But the first thing I want to do is, will each of you please just share one of your favorite moments or memories from one of the projects in the DRS? It can be a table read, or it can be an audio drama. But what's one moment or one day that sort of sticks in your memory, and why? Anyone can go first.
The first night that we rehearsed the masquerade with Bell Stratagem.
Yeah. And that was an amazing night. And it was the first time that it's the moment when Frances realizes Savile's in London. It's the beginning of her great emotional journey of the second half of that play. Up to that point, she doesn't know. It was really fun to watch you and Ron get to start discovering that on the night that we rehearsed that.
A cherished memory of mine is when we were working on Man of Mode, and there was one. It was towards the end of the process, and it was one rehearsal where we had done a run, and I think that we were still kind of struggling with the play and struggling to figure out what was going to be a sort of the story moving through it. And Ron and I were like, I think that these two characters are in love with each other, and just discovering this rich, exciting moment that we only had really half of one scene to explore it. But I think that that's something that's so fun about these plays, is just the characters are so complex, and we get to discover these things about them.
And I think it was the next night, it was the next run that I held you and Ron back, because I was like, did you guys decide something? Because it was just an entirely different play the next night. I was like, Jill, you were there. You remember this. I was like, did Ron just decide to make Doraemon in love with Amelia? Like, against Etheridge's text? Like, did he? And I held him back, and I was like, I was sort of talking around it. Then at one point, Emily was like, oh yeah, they're in love. And I was like, okay, great. And you know what? You stuck to it. We talked about it, and it ended up being this. It ended up being in many ways like the missing puzzle piece. Even though Etheridge didn't intend it, it ended up being our keystone to understanding that play, was that Doraemon was desperately in love with a woman who he knew he was not worthy of, and that was why he was following every other woman alive. It was all to distract himself from her. It just ended up being this amazing, like, we figured it out. All right, you figured it out. I did nothing. You figured it out, and then we just sort of ran with it. It was great. What about you, Jeff?
That was such, yeah, that's so funny. Like, I remember that realization, like, with my camera off. I wish Zoom captured my face, because I remember when, like, Emily had said that, I was like, there was like a moment of like, oh my goodness, this is a whole nother scope. Like, okay. I wish I would just like record some of my organic reactions that probably happen off screen during rehearsals. Like, it's so great. So I have so many. Am I allowed to pick two, Claire? Is that allowed? Okay. And it's, both of them actually, they both have to do with like the company aspect, or both moments. A lot of folks were on the screen, and both involve masks in some way. To me, I think for the Rover, it's the moment when everyone is on stage and masked, and then Wilmore and Helena unmasked, and then we're forced to kind of sit in their love and their realization. And I think, to me, why that sticks out to me, and it's going to be a catapult to why the other moment I'm going to share too is being my favorite. Because we're doing these things on Zoom, that was just a moment to me that everything was like right here, right now, right purpose, right time. Because I think the staging of that, Claire, was so stunning, because it was like a way of also using Zoom as well as telling the story. Like, it was so powerful to see everyone's boxes with a sheath over it, essentially, right? Because characters had their mask on, and then you were literally forced to see the physical rawness of these characters, but everyone around them supporting them by being masked and allowing this sort of visual to be right in the viewer's face, right? So there's so many things going on, and it was a breath in a piece that it's so like go, 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 right? Pen fights happening every way you turn, and then so there's that, and then that kind of brings me to a moment in Bells at the very end when Ben Apple does the thing where he starts saying words and you can't stop like focusing in on the screen, and your whole body is moved. Ben, like, you are such a stunning human, and that just comes out through all of your characters. So the whole DRS. But it's the moment when we truly see Doricourt is madly in love with Letitia and takes her for every form that she is, and like internally, externally, like their souls meet, right? It's another moment.
She unmasks finally. She takes off her mask, and his response is, "You're perfect as you are."
Yeah. And then again, we get to also, and this time, everyone is like, most people are on screen, but we get to see that community, and everyone's sort of sharing in that soul moment a step more. So yeah, both, as I talked them out too, I'm like, wow, they are related in more ways than one. So those have been some one step further soul moments for me of the DRS. Yeah.
Thank you. And they're perfectly in reverse, right? Because in Rover, everyone was masked, and then Helena takes off her mask, and Wilmore is like, oh my gosh, you are the most beautiful person I have ever seen. And in the Bells moment, everyone is unmasked except for Letitia, who is wearing a mask, and then she takes it off and joins the community and says, this is who I am, these are my people, and take me for what I am or don't take me at all. And he says, of course I take you. I take you and I celebrate you and I love you. And I like... I am obsessed with masks in all of their forms, the literal and the metaphorical. I talk a lot about mask face soul. It is how I approach all theater. It is how I approach all storytelling. And I think that because artifice is so integral to the telling of Restoration drama and much 18th century drama, artifice, superficiality, the performance of self, the fashioning of a self that will be acceptable or beautiful or desirable, right, or witty, and then the fear of, well, what I am underneath is different, and I don't know if anyone will love and accept me for that. And I think that the Rover and Bell stratagem, because they have literal masquerades, they offer us a way to manifest that kind of theoretical notion of mask-faced soul in a very literal and real way. And it is in a real way that you actually can do on Zoom. As long as you have a masquerade mask, which we all do, as long as you have one, you can get that sense of realism, and you can get the power moment, the power of the unmasking. That is something that actually translates in this platform beautifully.
Yeah.
I could never in a million years pick a moment, and Jill, even you limiting it to 2, I think is really impressive. I think for me, a moment of true breakthrough. Yeah. Wow, I might cry. When we were rehearsing the masquerade scene, I knew that I wanted, I did a lot of choreography with the masks that is not in the script. So I went through and I decided who was going to have their mask on when or not on, or when they were going to lift it off. Like, I went through and pinpointed that for all of the major characters because I wanted to tell a story about unmasking in the masquerade scene. The only major character who doesn't ever come unmasked is Letty herself, who is still performing and still running her stratagem. And I knew that I wanted Doricourt at some point in their scene when they are alone together and he has pursued her into presumably a hallway, and they are flirting their faces off. I knew that I wanted at some point for Doricourt to unmask. I knew that I wanted it. I didn't know how or when or why. I hadn't decided yet. And I had a couple moments of like, maybe it's here, or maybe it's here, or maybe this is when he takes it off. And is he taking it off as a seduction tactic? Is he taking it off because he just doesn't like having anything between him and this woman anymore? Is he taking it off because he wants her to take hers off and it's like an encouraging? Like, I didn't know. I just didn't know what I wanted it to be. I just knew I wanted his to come off and hers to stay on. And I had this one moment in my script of like, this is probably where I want to try it happening. I had like 3 places. One that I was like, I think this is. But I didn't tell Ben, and I told him before we did the scene. I think it's the same rehearsal you're talking about, Claire. I was like, I'm just not going to tell him. I just told him, I was like, take it off at some point. Take it off when it feels organic to you as an actor. And if that works, we will just leave it alone, and I will never tell you my moments. We'll just go with, your instinct. But do it where you think it happens. He did it at that moment. The moment that I had started my script. Without knowing that I had started, without knowing that I had thought about it. He had no way of knowing from any of my text in that rehearsal or any previously of when I might want it to happen or how I might want it to happen. It was like he read my mind. And so we get to that moment in the script of, what if you loved him and he were worthy of your love? And the middle of that line, he said, what if you loved him and he took it off and he were worthy of your love? And you were like, Jill, like, I totally dropped out of character, I feel. I don't know if I was in the scene or not. I felt like I was having like an out-of-body experience because I was like, I didn't know where I ended and Letty began. I was so bowled over by that. I was so, like, moved and amazed by that he had intuited it, and that we were both thinking apparently so in line, like we apparently our wavelengths about these two people were so similar that even without talking about it, he was able to just, like, I don't know, I feel like I'm doing a bad job of explaining it, but it truly was like, even on Zoom, I was like, oh my God.
No, it was one of the most like organic and authentic workings. Like we've talked about, right, how like the chemistry of all of us have been able to work on each other, and then that to me was just like, almost like a beautiful happenstance of like, okay, well now we're taking it a step further and your brains are actually working on each other, like telepathically you just knew that this was happening.
Yeah.
Because I remember, Claire, you had shared when about yet you would want him to, and then when he did it again, I was like, where's Zoom recording my facial expression? I had a moment of like, oh my goodness, like that just happened. And then Claire, I think you're saying like you were fully you were not out of it at all. You were sucked further into it. I think that's, and it just, it was such an authentic, it was great.
Authenticity. That's authenticity and artifice. That's what I love. That's what I'm interested in. I think that's what restoration and 18th century drama is about. And that was a moment of here's the authenticity shining through the artifice. Literal artifice of a gold filigree mask. It is shining through. All right. The last thing I want to do, Emily, is give you a chance to share the absolutely amazing next step on your life path.
Yes, Claire has done a great job of gassing me up on this exciting new step. I'm going to be going to grad school next year, which is very exciting, although also tinged with sadness because it means less time and space to be doing theater out in the world like with Sweet Tea. But I am very, very excited. I'm going to be getting my MFA in playwriting at Columbia. And I'm very excited, very overwhelmed, and really looking forward to it. So thank you for letting me share, Claire.
Thank you for sharing, and thank you for letting us embarrass you. Congratulations, Em. I'm so, so happy for you and excited for you. No one deserves it more. You are going to make such an amazing Columbia MFA. They're so lucky to have you. And I know that the plays that you are going to write, we are going to be performing and talking about hundreds of years later. So just prepare yourself. Because we are all ready and excited to do the work that we know you are going to create in the next 3 years. All I want to say to the three of you is thank you from the bottom of my heart. You are the most extraordinary colleagues and artists. I could not be a luckier director or friend. And so Claire Whitman and Jill Robinson and Emily Garrison, I love you. I thank you. I'm so excited to finish this journey with you. And to anyone out there watching and listening, thank you so much for joining us today. We really, really hope that you come and see our performance of The School for Scandal on Saturday, June 12th at 7:30 p.m. Eastern. It will be our last performance in the DRS, and it will be such a party. It will be such a joy. So come and celebrate with us and bring a cocktail of your choice. And with that, friends, I think I'm going to play us out. Bye!